Hello, everyone. Welcome to East is a Podcast. My name is Louis Allday. I'm guest hosting this episode, and I am very happy today to be joined by Fida Jiryis, author of Stranger in My Own Land, which, if you're watching on video, I'm showing a physical copy of now. It came out, was it the end of 2022, I think? Yeah, and a paperback version is coming out in August of this year. Fida is joining us from Fasuta in the north of Palestine. So welcome, Fida. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Louis. I'm very happy to be with you today.
Very happy to have you. So I've read the book. You very kindly gifted it to me. It's a remarkable book, actually, in a lot of ways. It is, it's a family history at its core, but obviously through that family history, it tells more than 50 years of Palestinian history. Those things are combined and interweaved in a really moving and powerful way. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your motivations for writing the book were, because clearly it was, both from its length and detail and scope, it's evident it was a huge undertaking. And it combines, obviously, well, without putting words in your mouth, I would imagine it combines both kind of personal and political motivations, although obviously distinguishing between those two is maybe a false dichotomy. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, why did you write the book, and where did it kind of spring from?
Hey, thank you, Louis. I think the motivation for writing the book sprang up first and foremost from our own family history, which has quite a few I could say, remarkable or painful stations, and is also representative in many ways of the history of the Palestinian people as a whole, but on the other hand, has some unique points. Maybe the chief among them is the fact that we are among less than 10 people who managed to return to their ancestral village in Palestine, specifically in the Galilee in the north, after the Oslo Accords.
Can I just clarify? Less than 10 people?
Less than 10 people, yes. The process of the Oslo Accords was never intended to let any Palestinian refugees come back, obviously, to their hometowns or tradition or villages of origin in Palestine 48, or what became Israel. There was a small clause in the Oslo Accords that allowed for the return of some senior PLO personnel on a case-by-case basis. And there were other conditions, like the fact that they had held Israeli ID before leaving, which my father did. In other words, they were not refugees. Israel wanted to close the door firmly on any attempt or any precedent for any refugees to return. So the motivation really for the book was, we came back and I found myself in an extremely unique place, because here I was as a Palestinian who'd been born and grown up outside, and we can elaborate on this in the conversation. I suddenly found myself returning to Palestine in a completely unexpected way, at least for me. We had never expected to return. We were in exile like millions of other Palestinians. And when I did come back, first of all, I had no idea what to expect, because as a Palestinian outside, we had grown up hearing about Palestine, but we didn't have any idea of what it would be like to be living inside the Israeli state and suddenly overnight be granted citizenship in this state and have to join the 1/5 of its population. The remaining Palestinians that essentially remained on their land after 48 and eventually were given Israeli citizenship, and now make up a fifth of the population. Now, as a Palestinian coming from outside, the experience was so shocking and life-changing and jarring for me in so many ways, and I had no one to share that with, because there was nobody around me who had been through this. My family and relatives and people I met here received us with a tide of love, but none of them even had a clue to be able to relate to my story, especially as I had also lost my mother in the Israeli invasion of Beirut, or following it, in 1983. So with all this baggage, I came back. The other thing was that we, as a family, are among a few Palestinian families, I think, that have experienced Palestinian life in 48. In 1967, I lived in Ramallah, and also in the diaspora. We combined, the tripod, if you like, of the Palestinian experiences. So our story was unique in that way. The motivation really for writing the book was my family's unique experience in that sense. And the fact that we are one of few families that embody the Palestinian experience and all its tenets in 1948 and 1967, because my father and I lived in the West Bank, as did my brother, and also in the diaspora. So this was the main motivation. Plus, I'd always wanted to tell the story of Palestine, especially in my years of living abroad, when people and friends kept asking me that we know there's a big problem in Palestine, but we really don't understand the details. We don't know much about it.
It's amazing, actually, some of the stuff you said just then and previously about it being a kind of elements of a universal experience of the Palestinians, but also these very unique things. That's kind of, I had almost verbatim written that in my next question, which you kind of already answered, because I think there is something very interesting about the fact that it's a kind of combination of the universal with the specific. And actually kind of leading on from what you just said about your motivation, I think the motivation is obviously directly linked to the audience you had envisaged for the book, because I think, especially for a book like this, there's a real question of what level of knowledge do you assume on behalf of the reader? And I think, again, not to put words in your mouth, it seems to me when I read it, you had assumed quite a low level of knowledge, because there is quite a lot of, obviously very useful and important background. But I think you managed to do that in a way that it's still very useful for people who do know that history. Maybe could you speak a little bit about kind of intended audience, and then on the basis of that kind of intended or projected audience, what kind of decisions you made on knowledge level?
Yes, the intended audience was very much, as I said, in my mind, it was people and friends I had met abroad. It was anybody really wanting a one-book introduction on the Palestinian issue, on the cause. And I assumed when I started working on the book, I really assumed very little knowledge on the subject. I wanted it to be a book that you could recommend to anyone who wanted to find out more about Palestine. And at the same time, I didn't want to delve into so much detail that it would just become a history book. So there were a lot of decisions to make along the way about how much to include about certain historical episodes, in order to keep that frame going and to keep the reader, in the know of what was going on, but at the same time, not to swamp them with so much detail. So inevitably what happened was, thousands of words had to be taken out at the end, because in the beginning, I simply wrote and wrote. I did a combination of desk research and also interviews. And so I wrote and wrote. In the end, in order to tighten it, and because the story is already long, and it has a lot of milestones and a lot of points along the way, a lot had to be taken out as well. The final product I was happy with, because I think, it's quite long as it stands, but it's also a useful, as I've heard from readers, a useful one book reference to the issue of Palestine.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think making those kind of decisions it's never going to be. There's no perfect way to do it, but I think balancing those, at times competing things in terms of length, accessibility, knowledge level, I think it's a success. And I think it's very interesting as well. One thing that struck me reading it is that it's part biography, especially maybe the first third, where it's essentially recounting your dad's experience and life, and then at a certain point switches to becoming more just a direct autobiography. And I might have, but I can't think of a book that I've read that kind of makes that transition. So I'm just wondering, kind of, how did that feel? And because I mean, obviously you've worked very closely with your dad on it, but were you kind of conscious that you were doing kind of both at the same time?
Yes, and in fact, when I started initially, I wasn't really quite sure how I would do it. I started the book almost wanting to tell the whole story from my perspective before realizing that, there was so much material in my family's history that essentially it was really going to be two books in one, their story followed by mine. But the reason I made all these intersecting, overlapping decisions is because fundamentally I can't tell my story without telling my father's story, because my life played out as a direct consequence of my father's decisions. And at the same time, both of us can't tell our story without the history of Palestine, because we are both, connected. My entire family was connected to that story. So the challenge really was how to take these three interweaving narratives, my father's, mine, and that of Palestine and our cause, and try to weave them together in as seamless as a way as possible to keep a storyline going through them. And this is what I tried to do. And in fact, I still remember my confusion when I got to the part where I recount that the baby is born, meaning myself. And then when I had to make the transition a few chapters later and start speaking as I as, and I remember, and then I thought, well, how do I do this? When exactly do I choose that point? But luckily, I did manage to achieve this in the end. I haven't heard from readers that they were confused or that there was a choppiness there. It was kind of understood that now I'm telling.
Yeah, no, I think, I don't remember. I don't remember it feeling jarring. I remember it feeling kind of just interesting that it was like a transition was being made. Yeah, and actually, just again, in case people aren't aware regarding your father, I think this is one of the compelling things about the book, because it's really kind of continuing almost family tradition now. Because one of the things that your father is most known for is the first ever kind of detailed study of the 48 Palestinian community. For those that don't know, he wrote a very well renowned and still important book called The Arabs in Israel, initially in Hebrew in 1966, I think, and then later in Arabic and English in the late 60s, which you may remember I told you I happened to find secondhand in Beirut, which I have the edition here again if you're watching on video. And yeah, one of the reasons for the significance of that book is because the 48 Palestinians were so cut off and so isolated from the rest of the Arab world that they really had been for a couple of decades almost like a quite unknown entity, kind of in both directions to some extent. And I think that, again, for me, that was one of the most compelling things about your book, your experience as a Palestinian raised in the diaspora, then finding yourself in this settler colonial society, and what the reality of that was and is. And I read I was trying to remember exactly when I read it, but I think it was last summer. It was definitely before October the 7th, and before the ongoing genocide. And I think one of the things that really stood out for me, kind of reflecting on the book in light of what is happening and what's happened, is the numerous instances where, I must admit, I can't remember if you actually used the word genocidal, but you have seen firsthand and write about the virtual, if not actual, unanimity of such attitudes towards the Palestinians in Israeli society. Your numerous experience with colleagues and in other situations, just on the personal level, beyond the structural and broader level, which you became even more aware of, or were already aware of in the diaspora, but then saw in a different way. So I suppose what I'm kind of leading towards asking is, given that experience and given all that you've already seen and known, and especially on that, how deep and how widespread those attitudes are, were you / are you shocked by not only what Israel is doing and has done, but the level of support for it?
Yes and no, I think, Louis. I'll try and answer that by first going backwards a little bit. When we returned after the Oslo Accords, I lived here for 8 years. During those 8 years, I went to work in Israeli workplaces. I have a computer science degree, and at the time I was working in software development. And it was then that I encountered those experiences that you speak of. And I began to really come to the rude awakening, to the shock, really, of Israeli society and its attitudes and its perception of itself, and also of its relations to the other, especially us, the so-called Arabs, because that's how they refer to us. There's an extreme sensitivity towards using the word Palestinian. And I went on for a while, and then I left. About 8 years later, I went to Canada. I was there for a few years, and then I came back. But this time, I returned to the West Bank for the simple reason that I just could not live in and among Israeli society anymore, or see myself working in it. So it was a drastic decision after a relatively short time, just 8 years spent living here, but they were enough really to put me off. I went back this time to Ramallah, and I lived in Ramallah. And in Ramallah, I thought I was really getting away, but I wasn't, because in Ramallah, I voluntarily plunked myself under Israeli occupation. Even though I'm a holder of an Israeli ID and I can go in and out and so on, I was absolutely unprepared for the system of rampant control and oppression that the Zionist entity practices, on a daily, minute-by-minute basis against the hapless population. About a year and a half ago, just a half year or so before October 7th, I finally made an overdue decision, and I left Ramallah because I could not take it anymore. In the last 2 years, or even 3 years that I had been there, I had a rising feeling that something was going to erupt. And they were conversations that I was having with my friends all the time, and they didn't require any degree of political ingenuity or particular sight or anything. In fact, it was just from what was happening around us, because the amount of daily violations and attacks against people had reached the sky limit. In Jenin, in Nablus, outside Ramallah, in Al Biri, all over the West Bank. Never mind the situation in Gaza. In the last few months I was in Ramallah, we had curfew almost half the time because of the martyrs and the young men who had been killed in the clashes and so on. And the atmosphere of repression was just spiraling into something completely inhuman. The conversations with my friends were always, and my internal feeling was, something is really going to erupt. But none of us could even imagine what eventually transpired. I mean, I think the most we were thinking of at that point was a third intifada, or something along those lines, some massive unrest. When October 7th did happen, I did find it a shock, and at the same time, I didn't. I just thought, okay, this is, different from what I had envisaged, but I, as a Palestinian, and every other Palestinian, really can understand fully well where this came from, simply by following what Gaza has been through over the last 15 years, and even before that, 17 years. The international support part did not shock me at first, because, Israel, after all, as we know, is an agent of Western colonialism in the region. This is its function. This is, its purpose. And all of us know that by now. This is no longer, dismissed as some kind of conspiracy theory or so on. We know the function of the state. What did shock me, and I think what did shock most Palestinians, even though we all are aware of the West's standing vis-a-vis Israel, is the continued support after things clearly amounted to a genocide. And after their own populations had come out in such mass protests, to then go on supporting was the part that we, even if you call us naive, but we found it difficult to understand. The duplicity, the war on Ukraine and the immediate response, and then the war on the Palestinians and a complete lack of response, a really pathetic attempt at a response 9 months down the road. This is the part that we found shocking.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are feeling that slightly strange dilemma of not dilemma, but dichotomy that they aren't in a way we're not surprised and we're not shocked, and these are things that we did know, but there's a huge difference between knowing them as kind of hypothetical or abstract things and then actually seeing the reality of it. And actually, just I was going to ask you actually about international reactions, but when I said how much it's been supported or continued support, I meant internally from within this kind of the settler colonial population. Basically, I wasn't referring to the US or the West generally, um, because I think that's something that maybe some of these people were naive, but I think that is something that has shocked some people is the extent to which the violence is not only supported but often celebrated, and demands for more, for greater violence. So I suppose what I was kind of referring to specifically was, given your personal experience and interactions and the comments and experiences you've had, did that shock you, or is it a similar thing of yes and no? I mean, I'd imagine maybe it is.
No, in that sense, it's no. It doesn't shock me at all. It doesn't shock me at all. It never shocked me, not from the beginning, not in the middle, and not now. From what I saw around me, from what I witnessed, from the conversations I overheard, from what you read in the media, I mean, it's all around you. You know, a person would really have to be blind and deaf not to pick up on the average Israeli psyche and thought process and so on. Zionism is the founding project upon which the state of Israel was built. Political Zionism is what led to the birth of this country. Zionism, in its tenets, is based on two things: the image of Jews as eternal victims, so eternal victimhood by all Jews and all Israelis, usually, because of the Holocaust and because of European repression through the Middle Ages and so on. And in this narrative, they are the only victims, they are the only ones, they're always under attack, the world hates them, the world is anti-Semitic, and so on. This is the sort of the broken record that the Israeli state has built itself on. The other image is that of the superhero. And actually, I'm reading now on Zionist literature by the kind of any-year translation, the translation of books. And it's true. It's this image of the infallible hero. Nobody can touch Israel. We are the strongest army in the world, and so on. Now, when you put these things together, the eternal victimhood plus the eternal belligerence, what you have really is a terrible concoction where people can commit the most heinous crimes and never have a problem with their conscience. You have to add a factor to that also, which has enabled this project, obviously, which is the dehumanization of Palestinians. I saw it in front of me every day. To begin with, we are Arabim in Hebrew, which is the Arabs. The Arabs in Israel isn't just a term that they use to classify a segment of the people. It's actually a derogatory term used to classify us. Under this term are all kinds of notions that Israelis hold in their thought process that, they will not openly admit, but this is what it is. Even the term Arab work, for example, is used to denote, slapdash work.
I was just about to say, last week I read an interview with Israel Shahak from 1975, and he talks about how, exactly as you say, anything deemed ugly or cheap or low quality it is called Arab work, which I found, which I was not surprised, but it was like, wow, it says
given that most of this country was actually constructed, we're talking about actual construction of buildings by Arab hands, because most Palestinians work in the labor and in the blue collar industries and so on. Now, in the face of all this, and in the face of things that I hear, and in the face of this utter Israeli blindness and denial of the facts and of history and of everything else, really, I have come to the conclusion, having lived in several other countries as well in my life, I'm always having conversations with people here and telling them, you don't know how messed up this country is, especially more so because you live in it. You perceive this as normal. In my humble opinion, and aside from the fact that I'm a Palestinian, this is probably the most abnormal, messed up country in the region, if not in the world, in terms of the frames, the thought processes, the sort of the way they view society and they view humanity and they view themselves within that puzzle. So it's a very, very hard. It's very hard, for example, now to think of a resolution. I mean, when I wrote my book, I was recounting this history. Even I, who was, familiar with much of this history, I was more and more horrified the more research that I did. Because the more you delve into this and the more you see the history, of these crimes, you think, how do people do this for an entire century and go on doing it and on doing it and on doing it and never once stop to ask themselves, what makes a group of people get up and be so angry that they charge to the other side of the wall and they do what they did? This, for example, this question is completely missing. They're just the terrorists. That's what terrorists do.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think this speaks to the uniqueness, because we spoke about some aspects of the story universal to the Palestinian experience, but there is something very unique that you and, as you say, only a few others have, which is you were not born and raised within the state of Israel, within 48 Palestine, but then went into it, and so that you're then within it in a way that is different from those who have never been without. And I think that is one of the most maybe one of the most important and certainly one of the most compelling aspects of the book, actually, I think. And actually, just to talk, can we just speak briefly about that return? I think you were 22 years old, if I recall correctly. Do you remember, obviously not, immediately what transpired and what you became aware of, but that moment of return, do you remember that being a kind of joyful, optimistic time?
Yes. I think, Louis, without trying to, burn the story, as they say, too much, I'll just give a very, very quick, for the listener, just a very quick recap of, the circumstances that led to us being outside and then coming back. My father was 10 years old. Fida Jiryis is his name. 10 years old during the Nakba. He saw people from the neighboring villages being expelled. He lived through the Nakba. And he then lived under the military rule that Israel imposed on its remaining Palestinian population. From a very young age, he began, he understood that something terrible had happened. He went on to study law at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His main motivation was because he saw the land confiscations, he saw what was happening to his people, and he realized, that this was very, very wrong, and he wanted to be able to do something about it. I don't think at that time he foresaw just where that path would take him. He became eventually one of the co-founders of Al-Ard, which was really the first Palestinian political movement to emerge in 1948 Palestine after the Nakba. And because of that, he was hounded and hassled and put in administrative detention by the Israeli authorities and really, made things tighter and tighter around him in terms of repression until he had to leave. In 1970, he went to Beirut with my late mother, and my brother and I were born in Lebanon. In Beirut, he became the director of the PLO Palestine Research Center. And he also became an advisor to Chairman Yasser Arafat on Israeli affairs. And we grew up in Beirut as young children until the Israeli invasion of 1982. In 1983, the research center was targeted by pro-Israel agents, and my mother lost her life in that explosion, along with several other people from the center. From there, we went to Cyprus. The PLO relocated its cultural centers to Cyprus. The research center was among them. And all through this, we never, ever expected to come home. My father was in exile. Obviously, he couldn't just get on a plane and come to Israel. He would be risking imprisonment or even worse. And then out of the blue, seemingly, the Oslo Accords fell upon us and we found ourselves able to return. The first visit was in December 94. And 6 months after that, in June 95, we came back for good. I think what I remember the most is the first visit, because actually that was the first time that we set foot in the country. It was in Christmas '94, and my brother and I and my stepmom landed here. And I remember just landing in the airport and walking in, and we were completely overwhelmed. And the first thing I saw was a huge Israeli flag as we walked into the arrivals hall. And I remember that at the time, it just caused this stirring of a shock within me. I had yet to know anything about anything. I mean, I knew obviously, about Israel and so on, but, I had no idea really what I was coming back to. What I remember the most is the journey after that. It was in the night, close to midnight, from the airport back to the village. And the way, as soon as my father said, we're almost in Fasuta, the tears began streaming down my face because it was all so completely and utterly unexpected. When we arrived in the village, the tide of love in which people received us, I mean, it was something like a movie, really. Our relatives, when my father had arrived 2 weeks before, they literally formed a dance circle outside the house of my grandparents, the one that they do at weddings. That's how they welcomed him into the village. I mean, I speak about it now with goosebumps. And I realized that even possibly for Palestinians listening to this, especially Palestinian refugees, this may also bring tears to their eyes, because this is the moment really that so many refugees in their hearts wish they could experience, their return. This is what I remember about the beginning. And these kind of feelings are what prompted me to really begin asking Dad every day as soon as we went back to Cyprus, so when are we moving back? When are we going back for good? When are we going back? It was only 6 months later when we moved back permanently. And when I had to wake up from those happy feelings of being in my village and start understanding that my village was in the state of Israel, that I had to be an Israeli citizen, that I had to work alongside Israelis, and all of this, huge psychological trauma that I was completely unprepared for.
You mentioned the loss of your mother and what you just said, and given that tragic experience of yours, something that meant quite a lot to me was when I sent you my article about Kanafani that was used to introduce the republication of Annie Kanafani's book about Ghassan. I really tried to think about, because your mother, Ghassan Kanafani, these various martyrs, their loss and their killing means different things to different people and impacts different people in different ways. And one thing I tried to consciously do when I wrote that piece was think about it from the perspective of generally his family, but specifically his young children, who I believe were at a comparable age to you and your brother, I think. This was 10 years before your mother was killed. And I don't remember exactly, but you said something along the lines of, that I included, it kind of really it kind of hit home for you. I think I said something about how the image of martyrs is occasionally kind of sanitized, and the bewildered children left behind are maybe not thought about or mentioned. So I was just wondering kind of what spoke to you about that, and I guess that is something that you've also felt.
Yes, and this is something, Louis, that I frequently think about in our Palestinian context regarding the issue of martyrdom. When people are killed by Israel or because of Israel, they are martyrs, shaheed to us. Shaheed is implicitly understood to mean somebody who died as a result of Israel's belligerence or practices or attacks or wars. The concept of shaheed has a certain glorification to it. Like you said, this is somebody who died in defense of a cause of their country. It's a noble way to die, or as painful as that sounds. But I'm glad you touched on this point, because there is very little consideration of the human element of the family. Even worse than this, the family is expected in Palestinian culture to be proud, to We are told that, we are we carry this cross, we are on this path of, salvaging our country, our people, and so on. And the country, the family is, is looked at by others with, with pride, with, that, one of your members died in this honorable way, and so on. There's really nothing mentioned about the losses of the children and of the spouse and of the parents and of the siblings of this person, and so on. My mother's death had a ripple effect that really broke all of us as a family. Her extended family, her mother, who developed diabetes and hypertension very soon afterwards. She hadn't seen her daughter for 13 years, and news came to her about her death. Myself and my brother, whose lives were irrevocably changed, and without going into too much personal details here, but there are a lot of things that we encountered and suffered in our lives because of this, specifically because of this. This is what is really, really, really hurting me at the moment about Gaza, and what has hurt me about Gaza in the past, and about the incursions in the West Bank and everything. I'm thinking about the thousands of orphan children, and I can see in my mind's eye the path that they are going to follow. Their path will probably be a lot more difficult than mine. I was fortunate in that my father was still around. I was fortunate that he could get us out of the hellhole that was Beirut, or that we were kicked out, actually. I was fortunate that I somehow landed in, in circumstances that allowed me to try and get past that as much as possible, and go on to get an education and to work and so on. The children in Gaza, what are we looking at after this? Really? A few months ago, I was scrolling on Facebook, and I was looking at the news and so on, and there was a young girl and her brother, the same age as myself and my brother when we had lost our mother, and the same thing. And she just looked at the reporter. The reporter was asking her, and they were crying, both of the children, and she kept saying to him, "Biddi mama, biddi mama," which in Arabic means "I want my mother." I just burst into tears, and I closed it. And I think after that, I actually made a conscious decision. I think for about 2 months after that, I couldn't even open my social media. I was looking at news websites to follow the news. It is so utterly painful. And it's so utterly painful that these people, after the dust has settled, and after the world has moved on, and after we go through the next round of rebuilding of Gaza and reconstruction and so on, you're talking about an entire generation of traumatized children and adults. And this is the part of our Palestinian heritage, really, or our consciousness that really bothers me. But now I feel with Gaza, it has really changed. A lot of that has broken. People are really now coming to awareness of the huge cost, the huge sacrifice of all these individuals and what they must be feeling. And I think the scale of this is what really brought this about. Shaheed is no longer something that, we are simply celebrating, and that it's part of the process of national, salvation or whatever. No, Shaheed is a price that we are paying painfully every single minute,
I mean, when we're recording this, I think even yesterday or the day before, the Lancet, a medical journal, put out a small report estimating the additional deaths as being as high as 180,000, which is, it's staggering. And it, even though, again, it's this strange paradox I feel at the moment. It's kind of, anyone who's been following has known that 40,000 figure has been out of date for a very long time. That hasn't really gone up since January even, maybe. So we know it's just this like seemingly indefinite confirmation of things on one level we know, but they're having them, at least in this case, semi-confirmed by actual study and statistics is just, it's just horrifying.
The other thing, Louis, that's really that I think about, and I think a lot of people do as well, is the maimed children and adults. Have a very good friend in the US, Ellen Siegel. She's a Jewish American nurse who was in Sabra and Shatila. She was helping at the time, and I use a quote from her in my book. In fact, in the introduction to the Beirut chapter, in the Dark Hour, I use a quote from her about the massacres. And, Ellen and I found each other, and we write to each other, and she was telling me, that when the time for rebuilding comes, they will need so many of the, how do you call them, the artificial limbs prosthesis or something.
Prosthetic limbs.
They will need, accessible, they will need wheelchairs, they need accessible ramps, they need everything. And you start thinking, about a whole generation. We're talking about a disabled generation, if not physically, then psychologically. This is probably one, if not probably the darkest chapter of Palestinian history since the Nakba. In fact, some accounts are saying even the Nakba did not, in terms of casualties, it was nowhere near this horrific. And so really, it poses, sometimes I think, in my difficult moments, I think, is this some kind of mass ending where the entire country will be obliterated and we will be obliterated with it? This is where we are at the moment. You think about Gaza and you think, I saw, this video of this young boy, I think about 6 years old. He's in his swimming trunks in Gaza and he's running on the beach. This was just a couple of weeks ago, and he doesn't have either arm. He has stumps. And
I know the one.
Yeah, and this child is running on the beach, he probably has no water to drink either. And he's running on the beach. And you're thinking, okay, to what degree can human steadfastness survive in the face of all of this? And where is the world? Where is the world? Where is humanity? This is the other point that I wanted to, and I'm sure a lot of people who are following are also asking themselves the same question. This issue, the issue of Gaza, has opened up not just the Israel-Palestine crisis, but the entire world order. The entire thesis of humanity, all of it, this world that we've created and what it is based on. So it's really opened up, a whole, but these people are the ones paying the price.
And I think it's opened a lot of things up in a way that can't be put back in. I think, millions, tens of millions of people around the world, hundreds of millions of people around the world have seen not only the monstrosity of Israel, but the monstrosity that is the West. And I don't think, it's like Pandora's box that it can't be put back in. And I think especially the specific damage to Israel's standing, it's just not recoverable. There's so many different routes we could go in, avenues we could go in from here. But one thing I just wanted to mention is, and again, this comes back to kind of how many kind of key and important moments in Palestinian history generally the book looks at. One of the things that I found kind of depressing and grimly interesting was the way in which the Israeli invasion in 1982 and subsequent siege of Beirut, even though it was much shorter in length, it really was in many ways comparable to the siege and bombardment of Gaza post-October, in terms of like complete cut off of power, food, water, electricity, and then just unbelievably intense, murderous bombardment from air, land, and sea that targeted everything, to the extent actually, and that generally that Israeli campaign in 1982 was so violent that the majority of the members of the international committee that were fought, like International Committee of Jurists that was formed to study those violations, it wasn't unanimous, but the majority of them concluded that the campaign actually constituted genocide. And I think I knew that, but again, it comes back to that weird paradox of you kind of know this stuff, so we shouldn't be surprised. The precedent is there in more ways than one, but then seeing it, I do think as well, it is, as you alluded to, in terms of the international support, it's just the length of time for which it's been allowed to go on is deeply, deeply shocking.
And the question, of course, was, if these were Israeli victims, would the world have stood silent for 9 months?
Yeah, I think we know the answer to that.
To respond to your point, Louis, this is actually, interestingly, it's an exact conversation I had by email with my friend Ellen that I told you about just a few weeks back, because as I said, she was there during Sabra and Shatila.
that's what made me think of it.
And I was fortunate not to. I mean, my memories of those are just the time I was with my parents and watching my parents' reaction. But thankfully, I was nowhere near. I remember a few years later, I was an adolescent and I was in Cyprus looking through my father's study for something. I was just kind of leafing through the books. And I happened across a picture book, a book of photos about Sabra and Shatila. I was so horrified. I mean, I think I looked at 2 or 3 of them. Then I closed the book and literally ran away. I think I was about 13 or 14. I ran away from the study and I couldn't sleep and I couldn't even tell anyone, But Ellen was saying to me, she said, 40 years later, the mode of operation is exactly the same.
Exactly. It's just this, the scale, the length of time, and the destructiveness of the weapons that has changed, really.
Yeah. Basically, the Israeli premise is annihilate completely as a deterrent against anybody. Annihilate, just complete annihilation. This is the thing. Joseph Samaha was a Lebanese writer. I found a quote from him. I don't think I used it in the book in the end due to space. But I found a quote from him, and he said something along the lines of Israel has an existential vengeance, an existential hatred. And this is something that cannot be cured. You cannot pacify it. The more blood it spills, the more blood it wants, and reading this, I thought, well, yes, this is the reality. And the fact that, they've now been exposed as a genocidal state, they are, in a way, it's, yes, I'm glad finally the ICC and all these, but on the other hand, really, it took this long for the world to realize that.
Yeah. I mean, as we've discussed over the last few months, I'm not alone in this, but I do believe we are seeing the beginning of the end of this bloody project.
Zionist, I think, has now really become untenable. It's just, even among the Jews themselves, so many of the Jews abroad count themselves, they're members of the protest movement. Any human being with a conscience, really. And some among us are saying perhaps this is the very high price that we need to pay for liberation, just like others. The problem is that beyond all of this, there is the very real and very persistent fear on the Palestinian front. And this is something I also allude to in my book about, that really we're like a ship that's lost at sea. There is no clear leadership at the moment that's capable of, looking at the situation, trying to figure out where we go from here. There's no real unity. I mean, we're all thrashing about. The vacuum of leadership exists on both the Palestinian and the Israeli level, if you look at it like that. I mean, the Israeli government is really counting its days, I imagine. Having said that, there is no alternative. I mean, nobody knows what will come after this. So the frightening part is that we know all this, we're seeing all this, but the frightening part is that political developments are not happening in tandem with the suffering of the people on the ground. And by the time these political developments, eventually, it's like we're all sitting there waiting for something to happen. But meanwhile, a person is dying every, minute or something. Because of this. So this is the sense of, horror that we're experiencing. And actually, one of the things about my book, when I finished my book, I realized, and I wrote that in a preface now because it's coming in the paperback edition in a few weeks. I said, I realized when I finished this book that it wasn't actually an ending. The ending for my book had simply marked the point in time at which I was going to publish it. But I wasn't writing about something that had ended. The Palestinian crisis was ongoing. Little did I know or imagine that a mere 2 years later, we would be where we are. 2 years, actually 1 year after the publication of the book, exactly. It was in October 2022, and in October 2023, all of this erupted. So it's this sickening feeling of knowing that things are going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, while at the same time contending with the horrified feeling that nobody seems to have any clue for where to go from here. And without pressure from the international community, Israel will not stop, period.
No, I mean, I think it's very clear that the only thing that's going to stop Israel is force. Again, something that we knew, but I think has been confirmed in the most spectacular and painful fashion.
It's also being confirmed up here in the Galilee where I live at the moment, because Israel for 9 months has been thundering about invading Lebanon, and no invasion has yet taken place. The reason, of course, is that we're not talking about 2006 anymore, or the years before that, when the arsenal from the other side was a few Katyusha rockets, which would usually fall in open spaces. And which didn't really pose any real threat. Today, we're talking about a new, sophisticated arsenal. Nothing stays the same at the end of the day. No tyrant will reach the sky, as we say. But this new, sophisticated arsenal, we're talking about drones that make their way in that the Iron Dome doesn't detect. I'm writing about this at the moment. Here in the north of the country, for the first time, we see a mass migration of Israelis away from their homes. They've been away for 9 months. No one's come back. No one can come back. Now, this is the only thing that's preventing Israel from invading Lebanon, because if it felt that if there was no real counterforce on the other side, it would have done it a long time ago. It would have no problem whatsoever, as we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, actually, one thing that's definitely happened over the last 9 months is a lot of the, not solely them, but a lot of the analysis and kind of justifications and explanations of Hezbollah have been very vindicated in terms of explaining their role vis-a-vis Lebanese sovereignty, the role of the requirement of a counterforce for the protection of, not just South Lebanon, of Lebanon as a whole. And actually, on that point of the people, the Jewish Israelis around you having left, I think that, I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but you mentioned that to me, and you said it occurred to you that this time
my father.
They were fleeing and you had stayed, and for me that maybe clutching at straws at such a painful time, but I found that very very moving and very, I don't know if optimistic is the right word, but a glimpse of the future. I think that they will leave.
Yeah, a glimpse of the fact that tyranny cannot continue forever unabated, that no matter how weak the other side, how fragmented, it's the natural order of things. Human beings, there's, not because humans are heroes, not because the Palestinians are heroes, even though, to be honest, just the fact that we still exist today is a heroic endeavor in itself, after all we've seen. But as an aside, simply because of the fact that human beings have a limit for how much they can tolerate, Louis. There's a limit to everything. There's a limit to how much people can see their children being killed, their olives being burned, their property being stolen, them being downtrodden, their economic, livelihood aspect being completely vanished. There's a limit. At the end of the day, a human being has to rise up and say enough is enough.
One thing that struck me about the book also is there are several pages actually of the images of martyrs, ranging from Ghassan Kanafani, Kamal Nasser, Najir Ali, Fatih al-Shaqaqi, a real range. I just wondered if you could speak briefly about the decision to include those pictures. And I guess, we've spoken maybe more about the personal, emotional aspect of martyrs and martyrdom. But then there's also obviously the significance of them for the cause. And I was very happy to see those images actually.
Yes, because it came really as part of my effort to show that Israel was more than just about creating, this country for the Jews and then bringing them to it. In order to do that, it had to target the Palestinian presence in every single possible way. That included chasing Palestinians abroad, each and every Palestinian who was an intellectual, who was part of the national movement, who could in any way contribute to his people's awareness of the situation and their efforts to do something about it. So it really, picked out all these people and went on relentless assassination campaigns, global campaign, everywhere. At the same time, of course, is targeting the local leaderships here and so on, which obviously was a lot easier for it because they were right here under its finger. But what I meant to show was that really the Israeli project was as much about forming the so-called Jewish state as it was about eradicating the Palestinian presence. And to do that, Israel made a concerted, multifaceted campaign that has really persisted from even before the state was formed, really from the British Mandate, when the Zionist project really began to take shape in the country in collusion with the British, and all the way to the present day. This translates even into its policies regarding us here, its so-called citizens, the Palestinians inside Israel. I've just finished writing about the multi-pronged approach it uses. It hits us in, it gives us lower budgets for our communities. It doesn't allow us to expand our villages for housing. It gives us lower wages. There's lower employment opportunities. We are discriminated against. It sets loose a campaign of organized crime in our communities. It wants to make life as difficult as possible on all tenets to persistently pursue its goal of eradicating the Palestinian presence. And the choice also to include these martyrs was because I often feel in the Palestinian context, we've had so many martyrs, so many, that they're often overlooked now, overlooked in the sense that there's so many of them. You kind of forget them, not forget them, but it almost becomes as part and parcel of the struggle. And I wanted to give, to remember these people, to remember all these people who paid with their lives for basically a decision to stand with justice and to defend themselves and their country and their cause.
Yeah, well, and I think actually there's something quite powerful about, obviously you didn't include everyone, but the fact that it's not just one picture of Kanafani and one, there is several pages and, several people on each page. I think it really, if it was all the martyrs, the whole book would just be pictures of them. But the fact that you included a lot, I think it does give, and it comes back to that question at the beginning about audience. I think for some people who maybe will approach the book from a position of, and I say this without judgment, position of ignorance or naivety, I can imagine people skimming, reading, flicking through those pages like, oh my God, just so many. And as you say, all over the place, in Cyprus, in Malta, in Rome, in Paris, in London. So yeah, I guess I thank you for that decision, because I think it adds to it.
I also wanted to give the photo of these people. I wanted them to see them as human beings, because so often, 50 people were killed in whatever, 25 victims were killed in whatever. And I wanted to give the photos. These were human beings. They were individuals. They had families. They had stories. Even when I was including the photos and, looking at them and so on, I was looking into their eyes. These were human beings. And that's the point I wanted to make to the reader also.
Yeah. And, as you say, whose crime was to one way or another to resist, and to resist for a just cause. And actually that leads to what maybe could be my final question, which is about the role of cultural production in resistance. Related to my work around Kanafani and other things, I speak quite a lot about the need, and I'm talking from a kind of solidarity perspective, the need to recognize the legitimacy and centrality of armed resistance. But obviously, I also fully support and recognize the role of cultural resistance and the role of cultural production in resistance. And I actually made this point just the other day in an interview about Kanafani with Sina on East is a podcast, that it's not about setting these things up as rivals or alternatives to one another. It's that they are all components of a very multifaceted resistance, broadly defined. And obviously you believe in the role of cultural production and cultural work in resistance, because I assume, because otherwise you wouldn't do what you do and what you invest so much of your heart and your time into. And I guess this is also related to this book, but also your work generally. Could you just speak a little bit about how you see cultural production in resistance and the cause generally?
One of the things that always comes to mind regarding the issue of culture is Israel's destruction and theft of the entire library of the Palestine Research Center when it invaded Beirut in 1982. It was absolutely staggering. They basically, in broad daylight, brought trucks every day from the north of Palestine, Israel at the time, obviously, what became Israel, to Beirut. They worked in broad daylight in front of everybody. They didn't care who saw them. And they were carting all the books of the research center, everything. They didn't leave a scrap of paper. In fact, from the witness accounts that I read later in preparation for the book, they opened the personal drawers and cupboards in every single office of every single employees and took literally everything. This is part of the cultural war. The production of knowledge and the dissemination of history and of knowledge among Palestinians is something Israel also fought bitterly from the very beginning. To eradicate a people, you have to eradicate their history and eradicate their narrative. So you hit at the history, you hit at the documentation, you hit at the narrative. We received a severe blow to our documentation, to our continuity as a people, our cultural continuity with the Nakba. So much was destroyed, so much was lost forever. For about 20 years after that, we really, with the exception of the few, well-known Palestinian poets and so on, but we were really in a state of almost, I call it the shock, really, the shock of what had happened. Cultural production remained limited. And only after that it began. When you start looking at the 70s and 80s was really the golden age of Palestinian cultural production, was when all those poets and writers, bloomed, some here and some outside. And then again, post-Oslo, we had sort of another lull while people were, I suppose, starting to believe maybe in the upcoming peace or whatever. So we had a bit of a lull. And after that, with the disappointment of Oslo, there was another surge, a surge that has continued and that has been amplified until today. What's happened in the last 15 to 20 years is the rise of a new generation of Palestinian writers that really began to take documentation into their hands. And they began to work in a plethora of different fields. Some wrote their own autobiographies. Some wrote about their families. Some about certain aspects of cultural production, of documentation. They began to make films. They began to reach out to the world. They began to go to international festivals and to international fora. This injected new life into the Palestinian narrative. And I think now it wasn't, the Gaza war, the Gaza events, and the terrible genocide we are witnessing. It was a major key factor in the rise in international support. But I think also behind the scenes is also the preparation work, in a sense, that has been done by the emerging Palestinian writers over the last 2 decades. In ways, we are reaching outside. I personally believe, for example, social media and the internet did us a really great favor, because the Palestinian narrative was able to be transmitted in a much, much easier, much faster way than it had been before, when it was really known only among the people who knew or who cared or who followed. Today, it made it much easier. So the importance of cultural production, I think, lies in its ability to reach minds and hearts everywhere, including those of your people. Again, Israel fights cultural production and so on here with us. I feel it all the time when I ask here in my village, what do they learn in the Israeli curriculum? There's zero mention of Palestinian history. They learn about Jewish history. They learn about the War of Independence, which only as adults they will come to understand actually meant the Nakba, the dispossession of them as a people. The cultural war that it fought against, Arabic, even the nation state law that came out, a few years ago, where we are downgrading the status of Arabic. So the cultural fight, obviously, for Israel is just as important as the armed one.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned the looting. Looting. Actually, I think even though I've used that in the past, it's maybe the wrong word because it sounds too kind of chaotic. They didn't loot it. They very, as you say, meticulously, deliberately took everything. And it's because, they know, they understand, and they know the importance, and they know, at least maybe not consciously, but they know on some level they are engaged in a full scale war against Palestinian existence. And so the resistance to that campaign has to be, is forced to be equatably multifaceted. So culture and cultural production is absolutely part of it. And when you mentioned social media, who immediately came to my mind was Rifat al-Arir, who, it was so far from the solely the of the things he did, but he was very active on social media in a very sardonic and effective way that, they didn't like. And they, again, they know on some level they have to eliminate people like that. So we should never obviously speak about, the images of martyrs that we mentioned. Rifat could be there now if you publish that book, next year, or, and him and so many others. It's an ongoing chain.
Shireen Abu Akleh, another notable example, has gone down in cold blood because, Shireen.
Who you do mention in the book, I think.
Yeah, the book ends with Shireen. Little did I know, a year later we would be looking at hundreds of Shireens, hundreds of journalists so far have been targeted. It's relentless, Louis. It's relentless. I honestly, sometimes I just pause and I think, it's not just a slogan. It really is amazing that we as a people are even still exist. Honestly, when you look at every means at its disposal has been used by Israel against us. Over 100 years, we are talking about a century, so it's really quite amazing. I mean, for me personally, it's very difficult to feel any hope now. Some days, most days, I try and find the will to even write anything or say anything. Weeks could go by when I say very little, but somewhere deep inside my heart, I try to hold on, even feebly, to the thought that perhaps this is the final shaking off. Even if, not now, not tomorrow, but maybe this is the beginning of shaking off of this, terrible, violent injustice once and for all. We can only hope. Because if after all this, we simply return to the status quo, I think the Palestinians really are doomed as a people. I mean, we really, this really has to go somewhere from this point.
Yeah, and we've spoken about this before. I think I feel like it's especially incumbent upon those in solidarity who are, external to it in relative comfort, to not give in to feelings of hopelessness or despair, not in a naive or unhelpfully optimistic way, in a, rational, analytical way. And, as I've said to you previously, I do still feel some hope. And I think the fact of the matter is, irrespective of the enormous human cost, Israel has failed and is being defeated in Gaza. And it's
not
very
just strategically. I mean, it's
exactly in where you are. They do not know what to do, and the internal and external contradictions inherent to the Zionist project are intensifying, magnifying, and kind of unraveling. But amidst that is, as you say, immense suffering and loss every single day. And I think a lot of people, myself included, have a hard time to see one without getting caught up in the other. But to take it back to your book, I think your book would be an ideal, and I think for obvious reasons, a lot of people probably are either looking now for a book to read or a book to give someone. And I think, your book would be very, very useful for that purpose, especially the way that in which you combine the personal, the familial, but with the broader political and historical context. I think it's very effective. And I would strongly encourage people to get a copy or to gift a copy to someone who they think would benefit from reading it.
Thank you very much, Louis. Thank you.
And I think maybe we should do another episode soon about the project we're working on with for your dad's book.
Yes.
But let's
Speaking of continuity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
But let's leave it here for today. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for writing the book, because I'm sure in many ways it was not easy to write.
Thank you very much, Louis. It was actually more than a 10-year project. It was probably the biggest project I've ever worked on, and it took a lot psychologically as well, because I was unearthing, family stuff that I didn't know before. So, like you said, I mean, I hope the reader finds it interesting in the sense that there is something they can connect with. It's the story of a person, of a family, and at the same time, to really find out more about Palestine. I hope it's useful in that way. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Louis.
Thank you.